Imagine this. You wake up strapped to a narrow hospital bed. The light above you flickers, not from age, but from deliberate design. Its pulse has been calibrated to break your sense of time. A voice calmly asks you questions. Each time you hesitate, a switch is pressed, and a surge of electricity floods your skull. Your body convulses. You scream, but no one answers. The people in white coats simply write something down, and signal for more. According to official records, this was called therapy. But others knew it by a different name, human experimentation. For more than a century, the walls of psychiatric hospitals have hidden some of the darkest secrets in medical history. Behind locked doors and sealed files, governments, militaries, and even private universities turn the mentally ill, and often, the perfectly sane, into test subjects for programs that stretch the definition of medicine into something far more sinister. Some of these experiments are documented. Many remain buried. And the truth that has surfaced is almost too disturbing to believe. To understand how secret psychiatric experiments became possible, we must begin in the 19th century, when psychiatry was still a young and poorly defined science. Hospitals for the insane had begun to spread across Europe and North America, but these institutions were more like prisons than places of healing. Patients were locked away, often for life, with no oversight and no possibility of release. In these shadowed halls, early psychiatrists wielded absolute power. Their methods were primitive, and often brutal. Restraint chairs, rotating devices designed to induce vertigo, even prolonged immersion in ice baths, all of these were promoted as cures for madness. According to surviving hospital records, one popular device was the so-called tranquilizer chair, invented in the late 1700s but still used well into the 19th century. Patients were strapped down so tightly that circulation slowed, and a box was placed over their head to block out sensory input. This was not treatment. It was control. By the early 20th century, as eugenics gained popularity among scientists and governments, psychiatry took an even darker turn. Entire populations of people judged unfit, the poor, immigrants, those with disabilities, were sterilized by law in countries like the United States, Canada, and Germany. Psychiatrists were not only complicit. They were often the ones leading the charge. Officially, this was framed as progress, a way to strengthen society by eliminating weakness. But buried in these policies was the same cold logic that would later justify human experimentation. If certain lives were considered less valuable, then using them for research was no longer seen as unethical. It was seen as efficient. Electroshock and insulin therapy. The first half of the 20th century brought with it a series of so-called miracle treatments. Electroconvulsive therapy, or ECT, was introduced in 1938. According to medical journals of the time, patients were strapped down and jolted with electricity strong enough to cause full seizures. Doctors claimed the shock could reset the brain. But behind the sterile language of progress, survivors described something very different. Broken bones from the convulsions. Amnesia so severe they forgot their own families. Weeks or months lost to a fog that never lifted. Even more disturbing was insulin shock therapy. Beginning in the 1930s, psychiatrists injected patients with massive doses of insulin, forcing them into daily comas. Sometimes, the comas were so deep the patients never woke up. In one notorious London hospital, records suggest as many as 1 in 50 patients died under this so-called cure. Yet the deaths were ignored. What mattered was data, measuring reactions, cataloging changes, and testing limits. The patients had no choice, and no voice. Consent was not required. The Nazi connection. The Second World War revealed just how far psychiatric science could be twisted. In Nazi Germany, psychiatrists played a key role in the regime's so-called euthanasia program. More than 200,000 psychiatric patients were systematically murdered in hospitals between 1939 and 1945. Gas chambers disguised as showers were first tested not on concentration camp victims, but on psychiatric wards. Survivors of those institutions recalled strange experiments before their deaths, forced sterilizations, high-dose drug trials, and brutal electroshock procedures. According to captured Nazi documents, doctors recorded every detail: how long it took a patient to die, what dosage caused convulsions, what temperatures a body could endure. After the war, many of these doctors were put on trial at Nuremberg. But others quietly slipped into new positions, some even recruited by Allied governments for their expertise. The Cold War was beginning, and knowledge, no matter how it was obtained, was too valuable to ignore. The psychiatric hospitals of the Cold War. By the late 1940s, the asylum system in the West was overflowing. Tens of thousands of patients were confined in vast institutions that resembled cities of the damned. The walls were stained, the corridors reeked of disinfectant and despair. Journalists who managed to gain entry described men and women sitting motionless for hours, strapped to benches or left shuffling in circles. These hospitals became ideal laboratories for those seeking human subjects. No one on the outside cared what happened inside. Families rarely questioned doctors. And patients themselves, already stripped of credibility, were considered unreliable witnesses. According to declassified reports, it was in these forgotten wards that the first whispers of psychiatric experimentation began. Quiet trials of new drugs. Sleep deprivation studies. The use of isolation chambers to test human endurance. The official language was clinical: trials, therapies, conditioning. But in reality, these were experiments in breaking the human mind, reshaping behavior, controlling thought, and erasing memory. The birth of a new era. As the Cold War escalated, so too did the obsession with control. Governments feared brainwashing, particularly after American prisoners of war in Korea returned with strange loyalties and confessions. Suddenly, psychiatry was no longer just about medicine. It was about national security. And in that climate, a question was asked that would change the field forever. Can the human mind be programmed, erased, or rebuilt? The answer, as far as history shows, was pursued not in laboratories of ethics, but in the locked rooms of psychiatric hospitals, where those least able to resist became the first unwilling test subjects. The shadow of the Cold War. By the early 1950s, the world stood on the edge of nuclear annihilation. The Soviet Union had detonated its first atomic bomb. The Korean War was raging. And in the United States, one word dominated the halls of power: brainwashing. When American prisoners of war returned from Korea praising communism and denouncing their own country, the Pentagon and CIA were horrified. How had these men, trained soldiers, been turned against their homeland? The idea that the mind could be broken and rebuilt became not just speculation, but an urgent matter of national security. According to official records, this fear birthed one of the most infamous projects in American history, MKULTRA. MKULTRA, the program that never should have existed. In 1953, the CIA approved a covert operation so vast, so secret, that even Congress was unaware of its scope. The program's mission was simple in writing but terrifying in implication: explore every possible method of controlling the human mind. Its director was Sidney Gottlieb, a chemist who some later described as the CIA's poisoner-in-chief. Gottlieb authorized experiments in universities, hospitals, and prisons across the United States and abroad. The methods were varied: hypnosis, sensory deprivation, high-voltage electroshock, and above all, drugs. Most notorious was LSD, a hallucinogen that the CIA believed might be used as a truth serum, or even a tool for brainwashing entire populations. But the agency faced a problem: to test their theories, they needed human beings. Willing volunteers were rare. So the CIA found its subjects in places where consent could be easily bypassed: psychiatric wards, prisons, military hospitals. The psychiatric connection. Declassified fragments reveal that psychiatrists were often at the center of these trials. Many believed they were pushing the boundaries of science, not violating ethics. Others knew exactly what they were doing. Patients admitted for depression, anxiety, or simple exhaustion were suddenly given massive doses of LSD without warning. In one case, a young mother at a New York hospital checked in for postpartum depression. According to her family's testimony, she emerged weeks later incoherent, unable to recognize her own children. Her medical records contained only one chilling note: patient non-responsive to conditioning. In Montreal, Canada, one psychiatrist would take these experiments to an even darker extreme. His name was Dr. Ewan Cameron. The sleep room. At the Allen Memorial Institute, a psychiatric hospital funded in part by the Canadian government, Cameron launched what he called psychic driving. His theory was that mental illness could be erased by breaking down a patient's mind entirely, then rebuilding it from scratch. According to court documents and survivor testimonies, the process was brutal. Patients were placed into drug-induced comas lasting weeks, sometimes months. During this time, they were subjected to thousands of hours of repetitive messages played on tape recorders, commands to change their behavior, to forget, to obey. Electroshock therapy was administered at intensities far beyond standard medical practice. Cameron himself admitted to using doses 20 to 40 times stronger than normal. The goal was not healing. It was erasure. Many patients lost their ability to speak. Others forgot how to use the bathroom, how to feed themselves, even how to identify their own families. Some were reduced to a childlike state from which they never recovered. Years later, survivors would sue both the Canadian government and the CIA, revealing that Cameron's work was secretly funded by MKULTRA. But by then, the damage was irreversible. The death of Frank Olson. Not all of MKULTRA's victims were psychiatric patients. Some were CIA employees themselves. Frank Olson, a U.S. Army scientist, had been working with biological weapons when he was secretly dosed with LSD by Gottlieb's team in 1953. Within days, Olson began to unravel psychologically. He told friends he wanted to resign, that he had seen things he could not accept. Days later, he was found dead, having fallen 13 stories from a New York hotel window. The official story was suicide. But according to a later investigation by Olson's family, forensic evidence suggested he had been struck on the head before falling. Declassified CIA documents confirmed that Olson had become a security risk. To this day, many believe he was murdered to keep him silent. His death was one of the first public hints of MKULTRA's existence, but the full scope would remain hidden for decades. Experiments without borders. MKULTRA was not confined to the United States. Documents suggest trials were carried out in Germany, Japan, and even covert facilities in Latin America. Prisoners, psychiatric patients, and refugees, people considered disposable, became unwilling participants. In one program known as MKULTRA, drugs and toxins were tested on animals and possibly humans to develop new assassination methods. In MKULTRA, hallucinogens were used on foreign nationals without their knowledge. And always, psychiatrists stood at the intersection of science and secrecy, offering their hospitals as laboratories for the mind. A web of silence. By the mid-1960s, whispers of these experiments began to leak. Journalists uncovered strange deaths, bizarre research grants, and missing files. But each time, the trail went cold. In 1973, as the Watergate scandal shook Washington, CIA Director Richard Helms ordered all MKULTRA files destroyed. What survived were only fragments, enough to prove the program had existed, but not enough to reveal its true scope. According to official testimony, 152 subprojects were identified, ranging from hypnosis to radiation studies. But the details of countless others remain unknown, lost in the flames of deliberate destruction. The chilling reality. For psychiatric patients caught in this web, the Cold War transformed hospitals into prisons of the mind. A man admitted for mild depression might emerge unable to recall his own name. A woman suffering postpartum exhaustion could lose decades of memory. Children placed in orphanages were suddenly enrolled in behavioral trials that left them scarred for life. And yet, when families sought answers, they were told the same thing: their loved one's decline was simply the result of mental illness. The experiments themselves were denied. But what happened next? Even after MKULTRA was officially halted in the 1970s, reports of similar programs continued to surface. Some believe the research simply went underground, renamed and hidden under new budgets. Others suggest the experiments never ended, that psychiatric wards and secret facilities remain testing grounds for new methods of control. What is certain is this: once governments learned that the human mind could be broken, manipulated, and erased, they never lost interest. And in the coming chapters, we will explore just how deep those shadows go, from electroshock and drugs to the darkest experiments on children, and the files that mysteriously vanished before anyone could read them. The Age of Electroshock. In the decades following World War II, psychiatry entered what was hailed as a golden age of innovation. But for many patients, it was an age of terror. Electroconvulsive therapy, or ECT, became the weapon of choice. By the 1950s, it was being administered in hospitals across North America and Europe, sometimes to dozens of patients each day. The procedure was simple, brutal, and devastating. Patients were strapped to beds, electrodes pressed to their temples, and a current of electricity sent through the brain. Seizures followed. Bones often broke. Teeth shattered. And yet psychiatrists insisted it was safe, even humane. According to official records, ECT was prescribed for everything from schizophrenia to insomnia. In reality, it was often used as punishment. Patients who resisted treatment, who complained, or who simply annoyed staff could find themselves shocked again and again, sometimes several times a day. Survivor testimonies reveal haunting memories. I forgot my own children's names. I could not remember how to read. Every day felt like the first day of my life, over and over again. The official justification was that shock erased disordered thought. But what it truly erased were memories, identities, and resistance. The drug revolution. At the same time, psychiatry embraced a new arsenal: chemical control. In the 1950s and 1960s, powerful drugs like thorazine and chlorpromazine were hailed as miracle cures for mental illness. Hospitals rapidly adopted them, and within a decade, psychiatric wards had transformed into drug laboratories. Patients were given massive doses, not as therapy, but as sedation. Reports from the era describe wards so silent that doctors compared them to morgues. Men and women once restless or violent sat motionless for hours, eyes glazed, drool running down their faces. These drugs did not heal. They controlled. They turned living people into shadows of themselves, compliant and silent. And yet, for researchers linked to government projects, this was the very point. If chemicals could subdue a patient's will, what else might they achieve? Could they erase memory? Implant new beliefs? Create obedience? These were not questions asked in the open. But behind locked hospital doors, they were pursued with chilling dedication. Dr. Ewan Cameron and the Allen Memorial Institute. The most infamous of these pursuits took place in Montreal, at the Allen Memorial Institute. Dr. Ewan Cameron was not a fringe figure. He was a celebrated psychiatrist, president of the American Psychiatric Association, and even the World Psychiatric Association. Patients came to him seeking help, believing they were in the hands of one of the greatest minds in medicine. But Cameron's theories were radical. He believed mental illness could be cured not by therapy or medication, but by erasing the mind entirely. His process, called psychic driving, was designed to wipe a person's personality clean, to reduce them to a blank slate, and then to reprogram them with new thoughts. According to survivors, the methods were terrifying. Patients were placed in drug-induced comas lasting up to 65 days. During this time, they were subjected to endless loops of recorded messages, simple phrases played thousands of times, forcing repetition deep into the subconscious. Some were told to abandon negative thoughts. Others were commanded to obey, to forget, to change. Electroshock was used not sparingly, but at levels far beyond medical standards. Cameron admitted to using shocks 20 to 40 times more powerful than typical treatments. The results were catastrophic. Many patients lost their ability to speak. Some forgot how to walk. Others regressed to a childlike state, dependent on their families for the rest of their lives. One survivor recalled, "I went in with postpartum depression. I came out not knowing who I was, unable to recognize my husband or children." The children. Perhaps the darkest element of Cameron's experiments was his use of children. According to later testimony, orphans and young patients were subjected to the same techniques: drug-induced sleep, endless tapes, and repeated shocks. In one case, a boy admitted for anxiety spent months under Cameron's care. When he returned home, his parents said he no longer recognized their faces. His childhood was gone. Families who sought answers were told nothing. Cameron denied responsibility, insisting the treatments were experimental but safe. Yet documents later revealed that his work was secretly funded by the CIA under MKULTRA. The patients were not told. They never consented. They were used as test subjects in an experiment not to heal, but to control. The side effects of silence. For decades, survivors of the Allen Memorial Institute were ignored. Their stories were dismissed as confusion, paranoia, or delusion, the very illnesses they had sought treatment for. But in the 1970s, as MKULTRA was partially revealed, Cameron's victims began to speak out. Lawsuits were filed. The Canadian government quietly paid settlements, though it never admitted fault. The CIA also compensated a handful of survivors, without acknowledging the true scope of what had been done. Yet many victims died without justice, their lives permanently destroyed by experiments they never agreed to. The pattern of control. Cameron's work was not unique. Across the world, psychiatrists experimented with drugs, shocks, and sensory deprivation, not for healing, but for control. In England, patients were subjected to insulin coma therapy, induced daily until some never woke again. In the United States, hospitals tested new chemical compounds directly on patients without explanation. In the Soviet Union, psychiatry was weaponized politically, with dissidents declared insane and confined indefinitely. Everywhere, the same pattern emerged. Behind the guise of treatment, psychiatry became a tool for manipulation, punishment, and experimentation. A web of secrecy. What made these experiments so effective was not their science, but their secrecy. Patients had no voice. Their families were silenced by shame or disbelief. Hospitals were closed systems, accountable to no one. And governments, eager for any advantage in the Cold War, were willing to fund almost anything, as long as the results remained hidden. Official documents often described these programs in cold, clinical language. Phrases like, subject non-responsive, conditioning incomplete, and, further testing required. Behind each line was a human being, a mind broken, a life erased. But when investigators later asked for records, many had already been destroyed. What remains? Today, the surviving fragments paint only a partial picture. A ledger of payments to Cameron from the CIA. A handful of testimonies from victims. A few photographs of patients, blank-eyed in hospital beds. The rest is gone, burned, shredded, or hidden in archives still sealed to the public. And so, we are left with questions. How many people were truly subjected to these experiments? How many never recovered? And how much knowledge gained in those rooms has quietly shaped the practices of modern psychiatry and intelligence agencies alike? A legacy of fear. According to official statements, programs like Cameron's psychic driving and MKULTRA ended decades ago. But the legacy remains. Survivors continue to live with missing memories, broken identities, and lives stolen by science. And for those who study the history of psychiatry, one conclusion seems unavoidable. Once the human mind was treated as an object of experimentation, nothing was off limits. In the next chapter, we will uncover some of the most disturbing allegations of all, experiments not only on adults, but on children, carried out in the shadows of hospitals and orphanages, where the smallest voices were the easiest to silence. The most vulnerable victims. If the history of secret psychiatric experiments has one recurring theme, it is this: those least able to resist were always the first to be used. And no group was more vulnerable than children. From orphanages to psychiatric wards, from hospitals to state-run schools, children were subjected to experiments they could not understand, could not consent to, and could not escape. Officially, these programs were framed as treatment, education, or even public health. But behind the closed doors of these institutions, children became test subjects in some of the most disturbing experiments ever recorded. The orphanages. Across North America and Europe in the mid-20th century, thousands of children were raised in orphanages. Many had no parents, no legal guardians, and no advocates. They were wards of the state, and thus, at the mercy of institutions that controlled every aspect of their lives. For scientists seeking subjects, orphanages offered a grim solution: children without protectors, whose absence of family meant fewer questions. In Canada, the Duplessis orphans became a notorious case. Between the 1940s and 1960s, thousands of children were falsely declared mentally ill and placed in psychiatric hospitals. The real reason was financial: institutions received more funding for psychiatric patients than for orphans. Once inside, these children were subjected to treatments designed for the mentally ill: powerful drugs, repeated electroshock, and even experimental surgeries. Some survivors later testified that they were used in medical trials without explanation. One orphan recalled, "We were lined up and given pills, injections. We never knew what they were. Some children got sick, some never came back. For decades, their voices were dismissed. But when the truth finally surfaced in the 1990s, it revealed one of the darkest chapters in Canadian history, a chapter that still leaves unanswered questions about how many of these so-called treatments were in fact experiments. The children of the Allen Memorial Institute. The Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal, where Dr. Ewan Cameron carried out his mind control experiments, also treated children. According to survivor testimonies, some of these children were subjected to the same brutal methods as adults: drug-induced comas, endless loops of recorded messages, and electroshock far beyond normal limits. One survivor described how he entered the hospital at the age of 11 for anxiety. He left months later unable to recognize his own mother. His childhood memories were gone. He would later say, "It was as if they erased me and left only a body behind." The CIA documents that later surfaced confirmed that Cameron's program received funding to explore how early personality formation could be altered, suggesting children were deliberately targeted to see if their identities could be reshaped before adulthood. Radiation in children. It was not only psychiatry. During the Cold War, government-backed experiments exposed children to radioactive substances in the name of science. At the Fernald State School in Massachusetts, a home for boys deemed mentally defective, researchers from Harvard and MIT carried out secret radiation experiments. Children were fed oatmeal laced with radioactive isotopes, supposedly as part of a science club. They were told they were helping with nutrition research. In reality, the experiments were designed to study how radiation was absorbed in the human body. The boys were never told the truth. Many suffered long-term health consequences. This program, too, was later revealed to have connections with broader Cold War research into human endurance, control, and secrecy. Experiments in silence. Children were also subjected to extreme behavioral conditioning. In the 1960s and 1970s, psychologists ran trials in schools and hospitals where children were rewarded or punished with electric shocks, isolation, or drugs, depending on their responses. The experiments were justified as studies of learning and behavior. But survivors recall the pain and terror. One described how refusing to obey meant being locked in a dark closet for hours, with only a faint red light glowing above. Another said they were strapped to chairs and shocked each time they answered a question incorrectly. These were not treatments. They were attempts to measure obedience, conformity, and the breaking point of a child's mind. The case of Laurel Heights. In the United States, declassified documents revealed experiments at the Laurel Heights Psychiatric Hospital for children in the 1960s. Children diagnosed with behavioral issues were given massive doses of experimental drugs, some meant to sedate, others to stimulate. The dosages were adjusted daily, with little regard for side effects. Nurses reported children collapsing, shaking, or screaming uncontrollably. Yet the tests continued, because the goal was not to heal but to gather data. Parents who questioned the treatments were told they were part of cutting-edge therapies. In reality, their children were part of clinical trials disguised as medical care. The stolen voices. Perhaps the most disturbing element of these experiments is how effectively they erased the voices of their victims. Children lacked the words, the authority, and the credibility to describe what was happening to them. When they did speak, adults dismissed their stories as fantasy or confusion. By the time many grew old enough to understand, the records had vanished and the perpetrators had retired. And so, entire generations carried silent scars. Some survivors would later describe adulthood as a fog of missing memories, unexplained fears, and deep mistrust. Others lived with permanent disabilities, unable to work or form stable lives. Many never knew that what they endured had been experiments, because the truth was buried too deep. The cold logic. Why target children? The answer, chillingly, lies in the goals of control. Adults are resistant. Their personalities are formed. Their memories are fixed. But children, especially very young children, are still malleable. Their sense of self can be shaped, twisted, and broken with far greater ease. For governments and researchers obsessed with reprogramming the human mind, children represented the ultimate test subjects. If obedience and identity could be engineered in childhood, then the potential for control in adulthood was limitless. According to some declassified CIA memos, this logic was explicitly considered. One fragment reads: "It may be that certain personality structures are best altered during formative years. Further testing required." What further testing meant remains unclear. But given what has already been documented, the possibilities are haunting. The survivors who spoke. In the 1990s and 2000s, survivors of child psychiatric experiments began to come forward. Lawsuits were filed. Investigative journalists uncovered documents linking orphanages, hospitals, and universities to programs funded by governments and private foundations. Yet even now, many cases remain unresolved. Records are missing. Institutions deny wrongdoing. Governments admit only fragments of the truth. And so, the survivors are left to carry stories that sound too unbelievable to be real, and too consistent to be dismissed. A generation erased. When we think of childhood, we imagine innocence, learning, and discovery. But for those caught in the web of psychiatric experiments, childhood became a time of terror, confusion, and loss. Memories erased. Families forgotten. Trust destroyed. The question is not whether these experiments happened, the documents prove they did. The question is how many more remain hidden, sealed in archives, their victims long forgotten. And perhaps most chilling of all, if such experiments could be carried out on children in the past, could they still be happening today? According to official records, by the early 1970s, congressional oversight committees began to demand answers. The CIA, pressured by whistleblowers and journalists, admitted to running behavioral research projects under the MKULTRA umbrella. Yet even as fragments of truth began to surface, the most incriminating details slipped through the cracks. In 1973, the order was given: destroy the files. It was not a casual instruction, but a carefully calculated maneuver. Sidney Gottlieb, the chemist who had overseen MKULTRA's most notorious projects, personally authorized the shredding of an estimated 80% of the documentation. Decades of experiments, financed by taxpayers, performed on unwitting subjects, vanished overnight into a cloud of smoke and pulp. Only a few stray boxes, overlooked by accident, survived. What they revealed was terrifying. Among them were invoices for shipments of LSD in industrial quantities, contracts with psychiatric hospitals, and receipts for payments to academics. The files showed that the CIA was funding doctors not only in the United States, but across Canada and Western Europe. Some of the most chilling hints suggested that private citizens, housewives, children, hospital patients, had been experimented upon without consent. And yet, for every surviving memo, there were hundreds of missing pages. When the Church Committee, a Senate investigation in 1975, attempted to reconstruct the story, they ran headlong into silence. Witnesses contradicted one another. Memories were vague. Many records had been lost in routine destruction. According to the final report, the lack of documentation meant that no complete picture of MKULTRA's activities will ever be known. But researchers who have studied the surviving fragments argue that the absence of evidence is itself a form of evidence. If the truth were mundane, why erase it so completely? Consider the case of the Children's International Summer Villages program, an innocent-sounding charity project. Recently declassified documents suggest that CIA funding may have been funneled through such organizations to gain access to children abroad. The surviving papers do not explain what was done with those children. The gaps, the blank spaces, are perhaps more horrifying than the words that remain. Similarly, files from the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal reveal extensive experimentation with psychic driving and drug-induced sleep. Yet in patient records, whole weeks are unaccounted for. Notes vanish mid-sentence. The same file may refer to a patient being treated on a given date, while another states that no such treatment was recorded. Survivors recall being given cocktails of drugs that erased their memories entirely. One woman later testified that she entered the hospital for postpartum depression and left unable to remember her own children's faces. The official documents insist that the funding was minimal. But the receipts tell another story: hundreds of thousands of dollars spent on equipment, soundproof rooms, and pharmaceuticals. How much was lost when the files were shredded? How many voices were silenced when paper turned to ash? Perhaps the most unsettling discovery comes from the Gottlieb memoranda that did survive. In them, he describes his goal not as therapy, not as rehabilitation, but as control. The aim was to discover whether a mind could be dismantled and rebuilt from scratch. The missing documents might have shown whether he ever succeeded. But they are gone. Or are they? Whispers persist of warehouses filled with sealed boxes, inaccessible to the public, buried under layers of classification. Conspiracy theorists claim that the most disturbing material was never destroyed but hidden. They argue that complete erasure is impossible in bureaucratic systems where duplicate copies, financial records, and correspondence always exist. Somewhere, perhaps, in the dusty archives of an intelligence agency, the truth still waits. Occasionally, fragments surface, too small to confirm, yet too specific to ignore. A line about field testing in safe houses, referring to projects in which sex workers were hired to dose unwitting clients with LSD while agents observed behind one-way mirrors. A cryptic note about remote interrogation techniques. Another file hints at the exploration of radiation exposure as a psychiatric tool. Each scrap raises more questions than it answers. But perhaps the most haunting silence surrounds the victims themselves. According to official testimony, the number of test subjects was limited. Yet interviews with survivors suggest a far larger scale. Some recall being pulled from orphanages for special programs. Others describe routine visits to hospitals where their parents were told they were receiving standard psychiatric care. Many victims had no idea they had been part of an experiment until decades later. The missing records mean these testimonies can never be fully verified. Some dismiss them as the fragmented memories of traumatized minds. Others insist that this is precisely what the experiments were designed to create, a fog of uncertainty, a reality where no one can prove what happened to them. It is here that history and conspiracy blur together. The absence of documents becomes a kind of ghost, haunting every account. Survivors speak, but without paper trails, skeptics dismiss them. Researchers publish, but are forced to rely on inference. And the agencies involved remain silent, insisting that what happened was a product of its time. In 1994, the U.S. government admitted to unethical experiments conducted on unwitting citizens during the Cold War. A presidential commission acknowledged that thousands had been exposed to radiation, hallucinogens, and psychological manipulation. Yet even then, the report stressed that many records were destroyed and the full extent may never be known. Survivors demanded compensation. Some received small settlements. Others received nothing at all. One of the most infamous cases, that of Frank Olson, a CIA scientist who allegedly leapt to his death after being dosed with LSD, illustrates the problem. Decades after his death, declassified documents revealed that Olson had indeed been drugged without consent. But his family's demands for further disclosure ran into the wall of missing files. Did Olson jump, or was he pushed? Was his death a suicide? Or a silencing? Without the destroyed papers, the truth remains unresolved. The haunting reality is this: history is written not only by what survives, but by what is destroyed. The shredded MKULTRA files are more than a bureaucratic inconvenience, they are a deliberate erasure of human suffering. And in their absence, we are left with fragments. A survivor who remembers electric shocks but cannot recall her own name. A receipt for 10 grams of LSD, destination redacted. A memo referring to special attention to children's units. A death certificate marked suicide, though family members insist otherwise. These fragments form a puzzle with most of the pieces missing. We can see just enough to know that the picture is terrifying, but never enough to understand the full scale. Some believe this was intentional. Not simply the destruction of embarrassing projects, but the creation of a permanent ambiguity. An uncertainty that ensures no court, no commission, no historian can ever state with finality what occurred. The missing files are, in effect, a second experiment, one not on the mind, but on memory itself. And so, half a century later, we are left with an unnerving question: what lies in the void between the documents? What horrors took place in the erased weeks, the missing patient notes, the vanished invoices? The silence of the archives is not peaceful. It is suffocating. And in that silence, the faint echo of voices remains: patients who never consented, children who never returned, minds rewritten in the name of control. We search the ashes for answers. But ashes do not speak. Only the living do. And their stories will not be forgotten. According to official history, the Cold War ended. The great ideological battles faded. And with them, so too, supposedly, did the darker chapters of experimentation. But history has a way of lingering in the shadows. The human mind remained a battlefield. And in ways both subtle and overt, the experiments never truly ended. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, the psychiatric establishment had shifted its attention from crude methods like lobotomies and high-voltage shocks to chemical intervention. The age of Prozac dawned. Antidepressants and antipsychotics flooded the market. Pharmaceutical companies promoted them as miracles of modern science. But beneath the glossy advertisements and carefully staged press releases, critics saw the ghost of MKULTRA, minds altered, not healed, under the guise of progress. Whistleblowers began to emerge. Some psychiatrists claimed that new drugs were pushed into trials without sufficient testing. Others alleged that entire patient populations, particularly those in prisons, orphanages, and psychiatric hospitals, were used as experimental subjects, often without informed consent. In one case, uncovered in the late 1990s, homeless men in New York were allegedly offered cash payments to participate in antipsychotic trials. According to official records, the men signed consent forms. But how much choice did they truly have? When survival depends on a few dollars, consent is little more than a technicality. Another story surfaced from Florida, where foster children were routinely prescribed powerful experimental drugs. Many were too young to understand what was happening to them. According to internal state audits, some were given medication combinations never approved for use in children. Records showed alarming side effects, stunted growth, seizures, suicidal behavior. Yet the trials continued, supported by funding streams that often traced back to the same institutions that once housed Cold War experiments. Perhaps the most unsettling cases were those tied to the pharmaceutical giants themselves. Documents released during lawsuits revealed that adverse trial results were often hidden or reframed. In one example, a study showed that a particular antidepressant increased suicidal thoughts in adolescents. The company reworded the findings, describing them as emotional instability. For years, doctors prescribed it to millions of teenagers without knowing the truth. Some researchers argued this was simply corporate greed. Others pointed out the parallels: deliberate concealment, manipulation of data, and the exploitation of vulnerable groups. The shadows of past psychiatric experiments seem to bleed into the present. But not all modern echoes are hidden in corporate boardrooms. Some are written in blood. In 1995, a young Canadian man named Alan, memorial survivor, whose identity was withheld in early reports, was found dead after years of struggling with fragmented memories of drug and shock experiments. His family insisted that his psychiatric collapse was a direct result of experiments conducted decades earlier at the very same institute tied to MKULTRA. Officials ruled the death a suicide. The missing records prevented any further investigation. Similar cases appeared elsewhere. In Germany, a series of deaths among psychiatric patients in the 2000s raised questions. Some had been enrolled in unusual memory suppression trials. Officially, the deaths were attributed to unrelated medical conditions. Yet families noticed disturbing patterns: sudden personality changes, periods of amnesia, paranoia about being watched. All dismissed as coincidence. Then there are the suicides of scientists themselves. In 2010, a respected European neuroscientist was found hanging in his laboratory. The death was ruled self-inflicted. Yet his colleagues later revealed he had been working on deep brain stimulation projects with military funding. Notes left in his office referred cryptically to losing control of the subjects and crossing lines that cannot be uncrossed. None of these notes were released to the public. His research disappeared into classified archives. Another case, in the United States, involved a pharmacologist who abruptly drove his car off a bridge after sending a final email to a colleague: "They are using the data in ways I never intended. Be careful." The data in question was never identified. His family's request for an investigation was denied on grounds of national security. What makes these modern shadows so unnerving is that they occur not in isolation, but in a pattern. Each case by itself could be coincidence. Each tragedy could be explained away. But taken together, the resemblance to earlier decades is impossible to ignore. Once again, psychiatric institutions intersect with government funding. Once again, documents vanish, subjects are silenced, and inconvenient evidence disappears into sealed vaults. According to official records, psychiatric experiments of the Cold War era ended long ago. But consider the technologies now available. Neuroimaging can map thought patterns in real time. Genetic engineering can alter predispositions to mental illness, or perhaps, to obedience. Neural implants can stimulate or suppress brain regions with the flip of a switch. What could not be achieved with LSD and crude shock therapy might now be within reach. The dream of total mental control, once the fantasy of intelligence agencies, may now be a technological possibility. Some researchers have warned openly. In 2017, a group of neuroscientists petitioned the United Nations, arguing that neurorights must be established, protections against non-consensual manipulation of thought. They cited the history of MKULTRA as proof that governments cannot be trusted with such power. Yet their call went largely unheard. Meanwhile, military contracts for neurotechnology continue to grow. Officially, the purpose is benign, treating PTSD in veterans, restoring memory in patients with dementia. But critics argue the line between therapy and control is dangerously thin. A troubling example comes from Chile, where in 2021, lawmakers debated a constitutional amendment to protect mental privacy. Their concern was not abstract. It was fueled by reports that corporations were experimenting with brainwave monitoring for marketing purposes, while militaries researched the use of neural stimulation to enhance soldiers' performance. If corporations and armies are exploring such techniques today, what assurances exist that secret programs, shrouded in classification, are not already pushing further? And then, there are the whispers of experiments that never made headlines. In 2019, a European newspaper quietly reported that patients in a psychiatric hospital had been implanted with microelectrodes under the guise of medical trials. When questioned, the hospital declined comment. The story disappeared within days. In 2020, an investigative journalist in Asia claimed to have uncovered links between psychiatric research institutes and intelligence agencies. Days before the full report was set to publish, the journalist vanished. Officially, he had gone abroad for personal reasons. He has not been heard from since. The pattern repeats: secrecy, denial, disappearance. We may comfort ourselves by saying such things are impossible today, that oversight and ethics committees protect us. But history suggests otherwise. In every generation, the tools change, but the temptation remains the same: the desire to bend the human mind to the will of authority. The missing files of the past cast a long shadow into the present. And within that shadow, tragedies unfold quietly, almost invisibly. A child given a cocktail of experimental drugs, her smile fading into silence. A homeless man who disappears after volunteering for a study. A scientist found dead, his work sealed away. Each incident is dismissed. Each anomaly explained away. But together, they form the silhouette of something larger, an echo of experiments that were never meant to end. Some believe we are already living in the new phase. That surveillance is no longer limited to cameras and microphones, but extends to the hidden architecture of our thoughts. That psychiatry, far from being liberated from its dark past, has been quietly folded into systems of control more pervasive than ever before. Whether or not that is true, one fact remains: the same institutions that once erased their crimes now hold the keys to the most intimate frontier of human existence, the mind itself. And as long as secrets remain buried, the question cannot be avoided. Are the experiments truly over, or have they simply evolved into forms we cannot yet recognize? According to official records, the secret psychiatric experiments of the 20th century have been thoroughly investigated and concluded. But step outside the official narrative, and a different picture emerges: a tangle of survivor testimonies, classified documents, and coincidences so improbable they seem to border on fiction. This is where history fades into something stranger. This is where the theories begin. Some of the most persistent claims come from the victims themselves, men and women who say they were subjects of experiments they cannot fully remember. They speak of blank spaces in their childhoods, of voices in sterile rooms, of drugs that left them floating outside their bodies. Many cannot produce documents to prove their stories. But in some cases, the fragments line up with surviving records. Take the testimony of Mary C., a woman from Vermont who, in 1999, publicly alleged that she had been taken from her foster home in the 1960s for special psychological sessions. She recalled being placed in a small room, injected with something that made her mind burn, and forced to watch flashing images on a screen. Decades later, she stumbled upon a declassified CIA memo describing psychic driving experiments on children. The dates matched. The location matched. Yet no file bearing her name could be found. Or consider Project Chatter, an early Navy program testing drugs like mescaline and scopolamine on soldiers. The official record shows it ended in the early 1950s. But private researchers have found invoices for similar substances in the 1970s, linked to psychiatric hospitals contracted by defense agencies. Were these simply routine purchases, or evidence of an ongoing covert program under a different name? Then there are the alleged safe houses, where covert testing supposedly continued long after MKULTRA's official termination. Conspiracy theorists claim these sites, ordinary apartments in major cities, were used to observe drugged civilians through one-way mirrors. Some allege the existence of black clinics operating under the cover of addiction treatment centers, where new forms of sensory deprivation and psychological manipulation were tested. According to one retired intelligence officer, quoted anonymously in a 2015 book on covert operations, the public believes MKULTRA ended. What ended was the paper trail. No corroborating evidence was provided. Yet the statement resonates because it echoes a pattern seen again and again: a program is exposed, renamed, and quietly resumed under new classification. Survivors also speak of phenomena more disturbing than drugs or hypnosis. They describe triggers, words, sounds, or images that induce sudden shifts in mood or memory. Some claim this is evidence of programming, a system of conditioning designed to create controllable individuals. The mainstream psychiatric community dismisses these claims as the product of trauma and suggestibility. But fragments of declassified files show that such ideas were at least considered. A 1955 memo from the CIA's Technical Services Division lists behavioral modification for the purpose of influencing decisions as a priority. Another document refers cryptically to establishing patterns of response to predetermined cues. What happened to these lines of research? Officially, nothing came of them. But if such work had succeeded, it would be the ultimate secret, one never voluntarily disclosed. The cover-ups, too, are part of the story. Consider the Operation Dormouse theory. According to this claim, whenever a psychiatric experiment or covert program is at risk of exposure, a network of friendly journalists and academics releases debunking articles before the story gains traction. These articles, published in mainstream outlets, frame the allegations as urban legends or moral panics, discouraging further inquiry. No proof of such an operation exists. But examples of coordinated discrediting are easy to find. In the 1970s, when early reports of MKULTRA surfaced, prominent columnists mocked the idea of government mind control as science fiction hysteria. Years later, the CIA admitted the program had been real. Another unexplained phenomenon is the destruction of archives far beyond MKULTRA itself. In 1999, several warehouses belonging to a major pharmaceutical company were destroyed by fire days before a court ordered the release of trial records. The cause was listed as electrical malfunction. In 2005, an underground records facility in Virginia containing classified psychological research suffered catastrophic flooding. The documents were declared unsalvageable. Coincidence? Perhaps. But critics point out that the destruction of inconvenient files has been a consistent tactic throughout the history of covert psychiatric research. Then there are the alleged programmed assassins, one of the most sensational and controversial claims. Popularized by books and films, this theory suggests that individuals can be conditioned, through trauma and hypnosis, to carry out acts they will not remember. The official stance is that no such capability has ever been demonstrated. Yet the idea refuses to die. One oft-cited example is Sirhan Sirhan, the man who shot Robert F. Kennedy in 1968. To this day, Sirhan claims he has no memory of the shooting, only of being at the hotel bar and feeling disoriented. His notebooks, written in bizarre repetitive phrases, fueled speculation that he had been subjected to mind control. No conclusive evidence supports this, but the parallels with documented CIA interests in hypnosis and triggering are uncanny. Another case often invoked by theorists is that of Mark David Chapman, the assassin of John Lennon. Chapman also displayed strange behavior and claimed a sense of compulsion. Again, no proof links him to experiments. But the pattern persists in public imagination. Theories about the continuation of psychiatric experiments in the modern era range from the plausible to the outlandish. Some believe covert research shifted entirely to private contractors, hidden under the shield of intellectual property rather than state secrecy. Others argue the experiments have moved into digital spaces, mass psychological manipulation via algorithms and social media. The most extreme theories claim that implantable devices, delivered covertly through medical procedures, are already in use. According to this view, the new psychiatric experiment is not confined to hospitals but is global, subtle, and ongoing, a manipulation of mood, belief, and behavior at scale. Mainstream experts dismiss such claims as paranoia. Yet even they admit that behavioral economics and neuromarketing are real fields, openly funded by corporations and governments alike. The line between influencing choices and controlling thought is, once again, perilously thin. The problem with all of these theories is not just the lack of proof, but the impossibility of proof. Decades of destroyed files, sealed records, and non-disclosure agreements have created an environment where definitive answers may never emerge. This uncertainty itself becomes a kind of control. Those who speak out are easily dismissed as cranks or conspiracy theorists. Those who investigate run into dead ends. Survivors who try to piece together their memories find themselves doubted, not believed. And yet, every few years, another small piece of the puzzle surfaces, a memo, a photograph, a payment receipt. Each fragment hints at a hidden world still operating just out of sight. It is here, in this fog of missing information and contested testimony, that the secret psychiatric experiments truly live. Not just in the past, but in the unresolved present. According to official records, there is nothing left to uncover. But according to survivors, researchers, and a growing body of circumstantial evidence, the truth is larger, stranger, and more enduring than any official narrative can contain. Some believe the truth was buried forever. Others believe it was never buried at all, only hidden in plain sight, scattered across data centers, medical journals, and classified files waiting to be unsealed. The questions linger. How much of what we call progress in psychiatry is built on the bones of unethical experiments? How many modern, clinical trials are echoes of older, covert programs with new names? And how many lives were shaped, or destroyed, by research that officially never happened? In this space of unanswered questions, conspiracy and history merge. It is a terrain of shadows where facts are few but patterns are unmistakable. And like a patient under hypnosis, the truth may be out there, waiting for the right trigger to awaken. According to official records, the story of the secret psychiatric experiments is over. The programs were exposed, the files destroyed, the survivors forgotten. What remains is an uncomfortable footnote in history, a tale of paranoia, Cold War desperation, and ethical boundaries crossed in the name of national security. But history rarely ends so neatly. The more we examine the fragments that survived, the memos, the testimonies, the court cases, the more we see that the story is not one of isolated mistakes. It is a pattern. A cycle. Again and again, the same forces emerge: secrecy, ambition, and the desire to control the human mind. The laboratories change. The names of the programs change. But the impulse remains the same. Imagine the corridors of a psychiatric hospital in 1957. White walls, buzzing fluorescent lights. Patients sedated, strapped to beds, their cries muffled by closed doors. Outside, a doctor in a white coat takes notes. His pen moves quickly. He believes he is on the edge of discovery, that he is reshaping humanity itself. Now, imagine a laboratory in 2025. A sleek facility of glass and steel. No restraints, no crude shocks. Instead, glowing screens display the pulsing colors of brain scans. Electrodes map thought patterns in real time. A researcher points to the image of a mind in motion. "We can change this," she says. "We can make it better." The setting is different. The language is softer. But the ambition, the desire to enter the most private sanctuary of a human being, the mind, is unchanged. And if history has taught us anything, it is that ambition unchecked becomes dangerous. Some say the experiments ended because they failed. That minds proved too complex, too resilient, to be controlled. But others whisper that they ended because they succeeded, just enough to be useful, just enough to be dangerous. What if the erasure of files was not to conceal failure, but to conceal progress? What if the fragments we see are not the story of what was, but only the parts safe enough to reveal? Consider this: many of the individuals who orchestrated these experiments lived long, quiet lives. Few faced serious consequences. Some even rose to positions of greater power within the very institutions they once used as testing grounds. The machinery of secrecy protected them, and in doing so, preserved their knowledge. Knowledge that could be passed on. Knowledge that could be refined. Knowledge that might still be in use today. According to official records, we may never know the full truth. But the absences speak as loudly as the surviving pages. The missing weeks in hospital records. The unexplained deaths. The research that appears under new names, in new institutions, decades later. Each absence is a locked door. Each locked door hides a room. And behind each room, perhaps, lies a truth that would shatter the narrative we are told. The survivors of these experiments, those who lived to tell their stories, often describe the same feeling, that their memories are not fully their own. That something was taken from them, or placed inside them. That their very sense of self was manipulated by forces beyond their control. Whether or not every detail of their accounts is accurate, the pattern of suffering is undeniable. And in that suffering lies the most chilling question of all. If a mind can be erased, rewritten, or reshaped, how can we ever trust the story of history itself? As you listen to this story, perhaps you feel a sense of distance. These were things that happened long ago, in another time, to other people. But history has a way of repeating itself, not always as the same event, but as the same temptation. Every generation discovers new tools of control. Every government, every institution faces the same decision: to respect the boundaries of the human mind, or to cross them. And again, the record shows that boundaries are crossed. The question is not whether it will happen again, The question is only when, and how deeply. And so, as the final files remain locked away, as the witnesses grow old and die, as the fragments scatter into silence, we are left with a haunting truth. The human mind is not only the seat of memory, thought, and identity. It is also a battlefield. And battles fought in silence leave no monuments, no memorials, only shadows. According to official records, the story of the secret psychiatric experiments ends here. But what if the truth is still unfolding? What if the experiment never truly stopped? What if, even now, you are already part of it, unaware, unwitting, a subject in a study whose purpose you will never be told? In the end, one question lingers, unspoken yet inescapable. How many more doors remain locked, with secrets that may never be opened?